right.
Go.
Well,
Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Wonderful World of Remnant Radio. We've got John Walton with us today. We're talking about the Canaanite Conquest. Was that war crimey, or is there something we don't get about that text? It's going to be an interesting thing. You guys stay tuned. It's going to be an exciting program. You are watching the Remnant Radio, a crowd-funded show where we interview pastors, teachers, historians, and theologians from different churches and denominations. My name is Joshua Lewis, and this is my co-host, Michael Roundtree. Together, we want to help you break outside of your theological echo chambers. If you're interested in learning about history, theology, or the gifts of the Spirit, this is the show for you. Now, you heard me say war crimey. It's a technical theological word that I definitely didn't make up. I'll have Dr. Walton kind of explain that to you here in a moment. But before I do, I'd remind you that Remnant Radio is entirely crowdfunded. If you want to support the channel, there are links in the description. The top two links will help support the channel. You can give a one-time gift on PayPal of any amount that you choose to give. Or if you want to be a reoccurring giver, you can give on Patreon. If you choose to give on Patreon, as low as $5 a month, will get you access to extra content. I got some weird artwork in the background. I filmed some videos kind of showing you some of the different pieces that we have, testimony videos from our recent conference. There's videos of like stories about me planting a church here in Ada, Oklahoma, kind of updates on some of that stuff. So it's kind of behind the scenes sorts of things that are uploaded there on Patreon. So that's kind of what you can expect over there. Without further ado, I want to introduce you to my friends here on the Remnants. There on your left, I have Dr. John Walton, and on the right, I have Michael Roundtree. Michael, before we introduce John, you want to tell us a little bit about what we have to expect today on this program?
Oh, sure. Well, we're going to talk about, things that might be war crimey. So we're going to get that definition of war crimey from Dr. Walton.
Very soon.
No, Dr. Walton has written a book about it, and Dr. Walton will give you a chance to talk about that book here in a moment. So read the book, and just kind of, we have a list of questions, but, it's always a challenge to think through. God says annihilate these Canaanites, and what do we make of this? And so we're going to just kind of talk through it. And there are a variety of perspectives, and Dr. Walton has his own perspective. And so we're just going to kind of interact, dialogue, and you guys will be asking some live questions in the chat too. So it's going to be a good conversation. Dr. Walton, thank you so much for coming on the show. And before we dive into the content, I wonder if you could maybe just tell us a little bit about yourself. I know, talk about the book that we're talking about, and maybe I know you wrote a more recent book too. I haven't read your most recent book. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about that as well.
Okay, well, it's great to be with you. So I've been professor of Old Testament at Wheaton College and Graduate School for 22 years now. And so I talk a lot about the Old Testament at both undergraduate level and at graduate level. The book we're talking about today is called The Lost World of the Israelite Conquest. It's one of 6 books in the Lost World series, and a 7th one is on the way. And so that's the topic we're talking about. This particular book I co-authored with my son, J. Harvey Walton. And in fact, many of the ideas in it are his brainstorming. And we wrote it together. And I'll be trying to explain those ideas as we go. The more recent book that you just mentioned is called Wisdom for Faithful Reading. And that's a book that tries to introduce students and professors to the ideas that can frame our interpretation of the Old Testament. The subtitle is Principles and Practices of Old Testament Interpretation. And it tries to provide a very accessible guide to ways to avoid some potential difficulties, and also tries to give guidance for approaching the Old Testament fruitfully and faithfully.
That's fantastic. And before I push you on this war crimey definition, am I mistaken? Is that the snake in the tree of life behind you, right? Directly behind you?
Absolutely, it is.
Yes.
And you can also see Gideon's fleece on the floor. Yeah, there are many other aspects which this view of my office doesn't get to.
Is that a Noah's Ark? Like right by your?
There are dozens.
You have like a little piece of Noah's Ark there.
There are dozens of Noah's Arks in this office,
Wow.
as well as Moses' rod and David's sling and a handwriting on the wall. And
geez, Indiana Jones would be jealous of your office. This is fantastic.
No end.
I had no clue that's what we were going to be. Okay, anyway.
Those who are watching,
let's
this is
talk
going to be like a Where's
about
Waldo kind of deal.
Where's
find the
Waldo? We're
artifact.
gonna be like looking for like Protestant iconography in your studio there, your home office. Let's walk through the Canaanites. Why is this like a hotly debated issue? I mean, God commands Israel to take out the Canaanites. It seems kind of extra violent. Can you maybe walk through some of the reasons why God would do this, or do you think God is doing this? Why don't you kind of fill us in on the debate and the different Protestant interpretations to this text?
Yes, in fact, I'm not content with the idea that God commands the Israelites to take out the Canaanites, to annihilate them, to destroy them. The book we've written offers a very different perspective on that based on rereading of numerous key passages and based on the reinterpretation of key terms. And so, in that sense, I would say that our view is that that's not what's going on. What's going on is that God is giving the Israelites direction to clear the land, not destroy the people. Clear the land so that his presence can be there and can be at home there. So, clearing rather than conquering is one of the distinctive ideas. Now, of course, people have taken many different views about this. They've tried to talk about the idea that even though we can't understand it, God is just, and therefore this is okay. Others have taken it as something that the Canaanites deserved, and therefore they've earned this treatment. All kinds of different approaches. Of course, it's problematic today in the context of questions about genocide and ethnic cleansing and all of those things. And sometimes people reading the Bible, dare I say, at a casual level, but not always that casual, come to those conclusions because they don't know what other conclusions might be possible given the evidence of the text. So we've tried to sort that out and offer a new option on the table for trying to understand these very difficult texts that give lots of people problems, both believers and skeptics.
John, I mean, Dr. Walton, maybe you could even fill me in. Isn't there also an argument about like, I want to say it's like a Nephilim kind of based argument that these Canaanite people had intermarried with angelic beings, and that's why they needed to be purged from the earth. Is that also one of the arguments? I'm not as familiar with the argumentation of the Canaanite, extinction.
Yeah, I imagine that that's out there, and I just heard the mention of Dr. Heiser, and I wouldn't be surprised if he took that kind of position, but I don't know that he does. And certainly the Nephilim are mentioned in Numbers 13, but they're only one description of the many, many other groups that are in the land. So I would find it very difficult to accept the idea that everyone in the land, Canaanites, Amorites, Girgashites, Jebusites, etc., should be all characterized as Nephilim. I'm not sure that the Nephilim should be characterized in quite the same way that might come out of Genesis 6 either, and that in itself is a complicated passage.
Okay. Well, I want to come down to this idea of you talk about clearing the land versus conquering the land. So they wanted to clear the land so that God could establish his people in a land and covenant and kind of get the whole thing started that's going to lead to new covenant and all of that. But I want to kind of come back to this because I know there's going to be some people who say, man, I could just think of passages where, they're told to take out every man, woman, and child, and they get in trouble for not taking out every single person. And here's one verse in particular. I just want to see what your take on it would be. This is Deuteronomy chapter 7, verses 1-2. It says, when the Lord your God brings you into the land that you're entering in to take possession of it and clears away many nations before you, the Hittites, Girgashites, Amorites, Canaanites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites, 7 nations, more numerous and mightier than you. And when the Lord your God gives them over to you and you defeat them, you must devote them to complete destruction. You shall make no covenant with them and show no mercy to them. Maybe you could unpack for us how you would interpret this, or if there's a word in there you would translate differently.
Absolutely, there is. And just a correction and kind of how that was set up, or at least a revision. I would say that he's not providing Israel a land as much as he's providing himself a land.
Okay.
Israel is to be tenants of that land, but they are there to serve the presence of God. It's being cleared for the presence of God, not so much for the presence of Israel, although the
Hmm.
two are uh, difficult to separate in
That's
some
yeah,
contexts.
good.
But the idea of Deuteronomy 7:2, the one that you just read, again, it comes down to that word about utterly destroy. That's one of the words that we offer a variant interpretation of. We talk about it as referring to something that's being eliminated from human use. And that's why it says, don't make any covenant with them, don't intermarry with them, don't even enslave them, because then they are like plunder for you. They are like some benefit that you have. And God says they are not to be for your benefit. The land's to be cleared of them. And so the idea of not utterly destroying, but declare them haram,
Hmm.
haram them, and that means eliminate them from human use. So again, it's when God talks about it, he says, I'm going to drive them out before you. That's what was
Hmm.
supposed to happen. If they refuse to be driven out, then that could result in violence and bloodshed.
Right. And just as a Josh, I'm going to ask a follow up question on this on the Hebrew word for harem. Um, if could you unpack for us why you come to a different kind of translation of that? Because there are going to be some people who say, "Well, man, Dr. Walton, when I look across all of the translations, they seem to render it, this utter destruction, that kind of thing." Or sometimes in some parts it'll be like they're presented as an offering, or but nobody seems to have this put away from use. And so is the biblical scholarship, has it been wrong? Where have they been misled? And they would maybe say, so the burden of proof is on you, Dr. Walton, to try to show us that the translators have typically been wrong on this. And is there, of course, when we look at a word, we look at how is it used contextually throughout the scripture, and then how is it used contextually in the ancient Near East, in the way people used that word in other cultures, and or words like it. And so maybe you could just kind of speak into that. I know you've done a lot of research on this subject.
Right, those are all strategies that we use to try to unpack the meaning of the word. Its most important aspect is to understand all of the varied contexts in which it's used and to try to use those details of all of those contexts to sort out the meaning. We're not the first ones that have come to this conclusion that it means eliminated from human use. In fact, the most prominent and widely known academic commentary on Leviticus, that the 3-volume deal by Jacob Milgram in the Yale Anchor series,
Mhm.
he comes to the same conclusion. And we came to it independently, but then also saw that he arrived at that conclusion. So this has been hanging around in the commentaries like Milgram's for 20 years, 30 years. And so that has to be taken seriously. Now, many of the translations were done before that time. And of course, translators always face the difficulties of limited time and and how many things are you going to go back and look at and do original research? If they did that on every word, translations would never be published. And
Mhm.
so translators do their best to try to deal with the data that they have. But again, there's evidence that suggests otherwise. We present a lot of it in our book to suggest why it is that we should not be simply interpreting it as utterly destroy. Of course, some
Mhm.
translations say place it under the ban. That's closer because the idea that it's banned from human use. So that gets closer. But that's really the same word that others or at other times are translating utterly destroy. And the
Mhm.
ban is not destruction. The ban is that they are eliminated from human use, ideally by being driven out of the land.
Hmm.
Okay, so
Okay.
let me ask questions because I'm going to come at this. You said that there's a wide swath of people who are going to understand these texts. There's going to be a bunch of different categories. Maybe it means clear them out. Maybe it means I don't know what this means, but God is just, or man, these people deserved it. I'm probably, frankly, cards on the table. In those last two categories, I'm not exactly sure what it is, but I know that God's just and they probably deserved it. That's kind of where I'm laying on this spectrum, just kind of cards on the table for you. When you're talking to a person like me who I would say flirts with biblicism, maybe to an unhealthy level, okay, just again trying to be as honest as possible, and I look at the text and people are saying, well, there's this piece of history or this grammatical key that changes the interpretation of these things. I think we have like these fundamentalist instincts. I do certainly that goes, man, the second that you do that, all of these texts of scripture become it's like are we giving up something? Are we opening ourselves up from attack from liberalism when we come back to text of scripture and says, hey, it looks like it means destroy, and all these translations say destroy, but it actually means cleared out. God really didn't pour out judgment in that way. And you have these like, and there's a rising triumph right now, especially in the charismatic space of almost Marcians, like new Marcians, neo Marcians, who are coming along and saying, hey, the Old Testament violence passages, they don't really mean what they say they mean, and then it really reinterprets the judgment in the New Testament too. So it creates a discontinuity when it comes to God bringing judgment and justice to people who are outside of his will, outside of breaking his laws, breaking his commandments, and the just and righteous judgment that he brings upon them for doing so. So could you maybe put my heart at ease, like when it comes to judgment, and maybe you won't, and that's perfectly fine. You've got no responsibility to do so. But could you maybe speak to that listener who's out
Josh
there
just
who's
wants to
going,
feel good.
yeah, I like the opposite actually. It would be so much feel goody if there was no judgment passages. However, there are, and I'm going. I have a cognitive dissonance and a worry that if we open that floodgate, suddenly all of the judgment passages come, washed away from the text of Scripture. How would you console a person that's kind of in that space?
Well, first of all, I would say certainly God is just. I don't have any claim against that or disagreement with that. I accept that to be fact, but we have to ask the question, is that how this text is built? Is it built as explained, motivated by God's justice? Well, we have to let the text give us that. Secondly, is it an act of judgment? Well, it could theoretically be an act of judgment, but again, we want the text to give us that. There are some passages that look like they claim that this is judgment, and we probably will talk about some of those as we go on in our conversation, but I would claim that they do not do so, that we are misunderstanding those. That doesn't mean that every act of judgment of God's is thrown to the wind. It just asks the specific questions of these particular texts. Thirdly, when we re-evaluate a text based on the meanings of words, okay, lexical semantics, the meanings of words, that's not just kind of throwing everything up in the air and saying you can do whatever you want. There are established tools of lexical semantics. There are ways that we make those decisions, and there are ways that we build evidence in order to support those decisions. Translation is a difficult job, not only because the languages are sometimes unclear in our minds, but also because many words simply do not have an equivalent in English, at which case we have to just kind of do the best we can to put that together. So bringing out new meanings of words is not just kind of floating trial balloons, it's a matter of bringing out evidence. And that leads me to my fourth point, which is the way we evaluate interpretations is by the strength of their evidence. Interpretation, the strongest interpretation, is going to have the strongest evidence. And so we have to use the evidentiary tools at our disposal in order to try to make good interpretive decisions. And sometimes we might be able to present evidence that others before us have not taken into account. Maybe they haven't even been able to take them into account. because that information has not been available. And so we're constantly on the hunt for more evidence to do a better job of interpretation. But the strength of the interpretation is specifically dependent on the strength of the evidence.
Dr. Walton, I want to just kind of digging into this word harem a little bit more, and you can pronounce it so much better. You sound like an ancient Hebrew when you say it. But just kind of looking at some text, I want to. One of the things I noticed that you said was that it means to put like it's to put out of use. And you said ideally by driving them away from the land, but it seemed to allow for killing, if that was part of it. But it seemed like you were suggesting their goal was to drive them away, and if they just really planted their feet down, then okay, they're killed. But that really wasn't the primary goal here. I'm curious if that was your reading, and part of the reason is I want to jump into just a few texts because they seem to marry the edge of the sword and utterly destroying them, or harem. Okay, so the edge of the sword would seem to suggest death was part of it, but maybe by your interpretation, it would mean more like chasing them out by the edge of the sword. And so I'm kind of trying to set that up. But here's some verses. Joshua captured Makkedah on that day and struck it and its king with the edge of the sword. He haremed them, every person who was in it. Okay, they captured it on that day and struck it with the edge of the sword, and he utterly destroyed it. This is the NASB, so that's the harem word. Okay, and I'm just pointing out they all seem to have death associated with it. He captured it, and this is 1039. Joshua captured it and his king and all its city, and they struck them with the edge of the sword and utterly destroyed every person who was in it, or haremed every person who was in it. Okay, so how would you understand those passages? Because they look like they went in and killed everybody, and it associates that with harem. So what would your take be on passages like those?
Well, we have to start with Rahab. In Joshua chapter 2, the key element in that chapter is her confession. Her confession is very inclusive of all the people. We have heard, we know. And so she uses this inclusive we. And what she basically says is, we know all that your God has done. We recognize how he brought you out of Egypt, how he brought you through the Red Sea, how he defeated the nations to the east. We know that. And we are scared stiff. We are terrified.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, now at that point, they have admitted that they know the power of Yahweh. They have admitted that Yahweh has given Israel the land. At that point, theoretically, but almost never practically, they should say, okay, we get it, we're leaving. But they don't.
Mm-hmm.
Their fear doesn't drive them to abandon their cities. Instead, their fear motivates them to stand up and fight,
Mm-hmm.
and to resist what they acknowledge Yahweh is doing. Now, at that point, when they refuse to be driven out, then the other option for harem, that is eliminating from human use, is death. But that's because they have refused to be driven out. Now, we can understand from a human standpoint why they don't want to just abandon their cities. We get that. Okay, but they've acknowledged that this is the work of Yahweh, and yet they stand against him. And so in that sense, yes, in those passages in Joshua that you read, death is the only other option if they refuse to give up the land.
Okay. Yeah. Josh?
Oh, sure. I suppose the verses that come to mind, and you're more familiar with them than I am, and we can probably run through a few of them. But it appears that in your book, that your argumentation is that the Canaanites are not expelled from the land because of their sinfulness. Could you maybe unpack that for us?
Sure. The ways that it describes the problem is not so much based in the idea that the Canaanites are perverted or corrupt and all of those things. It talks about they have brought impurity on the land, but that's impurity is not the same as sin and perversion and all of those things. They've brought impurity on the land. The most common thread that is developed is that if the people are not put under cherem, then they will influence and corrupt the Israelites so that they will then be unacceptable to Yahweh and to his expectations for the purity of his presence. And so it's the idea that they will affect Israel. The Canaanites are not expected to adhere to covenant stipulations. God didn't make a covenant with them. They are not obliged to the covenant. God doesn't ask them to worship him alone. God doesn't ask them to stop using idols, and he does not condemn them for doing so. They rather will influence Israel because Israel is so vulnerable to influence, and therefore Israel will find themselves doing those things which displease God. So again, when we look at the passages carefully, often those are the issues: the corruption of Israel, not so much the offenses the Canaanites have committed against God. If they're being punished for their sin, we would expect that to be indicated. And one of the things that we did in the book was to demonstrate that for the most part, that does not exist. There are places where it looks like it might exist, but we argue that that's indeed not the case.
Okay. So there are a number of verses that we could jump into, and I can see our live chat is blown up with various verses, some of which are probably all of which are in our notes here. I'm going to just maybe give the references for those who are listening, watching, taking notes. We're not going to be able to cover all of these, but Genesis 15:6, Leviticus 18:24-28, Deuteronomy 9:4, Deuteronomy 12:29, Deuteronomy 18:9, and Ezra 9:11. All of these verses, and you address them all in your book, Dr. Walton, but they're typically used to argue against your position. They're typically used to argue that the Canaanites were particularly sinful, and this was why it was just and righteous for God to drive them out of the land. And so maybe I'll just pick one of these, and we can roll with that. Let's go with Leviticus chapter 18. The context is a whole bunch of sexual immorality is addressed, and if I remember right, the last one was bestiality right before this verse in verse 24. And he says, "Do not make yourselves unclean by any of these things, any of these sexually immoral acts. For by all these, the nations I am driving out before you have become unclean. And the land became unclean, so that I punished its iniquity. And the land vomited out its inhabitants. But you shall keep my statutes and my rules, and do none of these abominations. Either the native or the stranger who sojourns among you. For the people of the land who were before you did all of these abominations, so the land became unclean, lest the land vomit you out when you make it unclean, as it vomited out the nation that was before you." So the argument would go like, look, these nations were performing all of these sexual acts, and those nations themselves became unclean. And it seemed like, while it's true that the old covenant, that the other nations were not under covenant with God, it seems that there was a moral law that expanded beyond the covenant that was in some ways encapsulated within the covenant. Certainly biblical ethics are fit within the whole of Scripture. However, there seems to be like a broader ethic that they were breaking, and somehow made the land unclean, and it vomited them out. So this would be kind of how the argumentation goes. And so how would you respond to this, specifically with Leviticus 18?
Well, first of all, we can see that it focuses throughout on the concept of unclean. And uncleanness, we know, is not the equivalent of sin, although certain uncleanness can be sin. But typically, they would use the term unclean when they're talking about a general impurity. Secondly, it tends to focus on how they've made the land unclean. And it's the land that has been made unclean. And therefore, God is going to decree their destiny. Verse 25 is translated, "So I punished its iniquity." The
Hmm.
word there translated punished is pakad, which is typically decreeing a destiny. A whole dissertation has been done on that. And the iniquity is the word avon, which typically refers to a calamity. He's going to visit their calamity on them. And so we have to think about our words carefully and what they're using. You can see that he says, "I'm driving out those nations." And that's because the land is unclean. And he doesn't want them to affect the Israelites who are living in the land. The word for abomination is toivah, and that pertains to things that are outside Yahweh's order, not to things that are contrary to universal moral law. They are outside of Yahweh's order, and therefore, if Israel is not keeping Yahweh's order, they will be toivah. Those toivah um, actions by the people of the land are exactly that. They're outside of Yahweh's order. And that's the issue that's involved. So again, we have terminology that's being used that all has to be unpacked carefully. In the book, we do all of that. We deal with each of these terms. We explore them in their contexts and explain how they might be understood in line with the interpretation that we offer.
Okay. Um, and just a response here. So I think you would agree that the things described in Leviticus 18 were sins, right? Like not just say ritual uncleanness, but that the bulk of these activities, because it's an unlawful sexual relations. So certainly Israel was held to these things, but wouldn't you agree that these were they would fit into like a broader moral and ethical, I guess, line that is
Romans
crossed,
Romans
right?
1, all creation bears witness. They worship the creature rather than the creator. They don't even need the law. Like they
Right.
had creation that bared against
Well,
them.
because I mean, I hear people like Matthew Vines quote Leviticus 18 when it says that, a man's not supposed to sleep with another man. He says, well, old covenant. So, hey, it's the new covenant now. And, we're all good. And I'm like, no, still not, man's not supposed to lie with another man. Um, so like if we say like abominations, it means breaking with the natural order. Um, wouldn't you agree, though, that the things in Leviticus 18 specifically broke with the natural order in an ethical way, and that these nations, and would that not imply that they were expelled from the land because they broke a universal moral law? Would you say that's accurate, or how would you disagree with that?
Well, that's several different issues on the table.
Hmm.
Is there a universal moral slash ethical law? That's an issue that can be discussed, whether such a thing is in existence or not. Um, do do the various pieces of literature from the ancient world suggest that everybody was working on the same general moral basis? Certainly, we can see some similarities between the legal provisions that we have from the ancient world and what we have in the Pentateuch. So those things can be identified. The idea about are the Canaanites being accused of these behaviors? That's the toughest one, I think, that we have to sort out. What we present in our book is that there is a typical rhetoric that's used in conquest accounts, that's used to talk about the other, the outsiders, and that adopts some typical terminology to stereotype outsiders. And these are the kinds of things that might occur. I mean, we even see it in our own American modern uh, political elections where one party accuses the other of horrendous things, child molestation, and all sorts of things. That's not because they can document it and take them to court. It's the rhetoric that goes along with stereotyping. And so, in that sense, these ideas can be explained as the rhetorical stereotyping of the outsider. Now, again, that's a tough line, and not everybody's going to agree with it, but it's another possibility to consider. Uh, do we have evidence of the Canaanites specifically in specific instances being engaged in those kinds of behaviors? No, we just have the general statements that we find in a passage like the one we've just been reading.
Okay. Okay.
So let me just kind of push back here, because Michael mentioned Leviticus. I'd like to get maybe a cleaner answer to that question. Are you saying that men were not lying with men in Leviticus? I mean, we certainly have up until this point homosexual relationship destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, both in articulation, but also in the narrative text was being described when the angels go into the city. You know, the angels are trying, at least the men of the city try to come out and rape the angels. So like, it's clear that homosexual relationships were taking place in ancient Near Eastern world. Again, I would say it's clear within the flow of the narrative, but then also in Leviticus, I don't think that he's saying, hey, you guys don't do this action that is like a political jargon or overspeak of the illustration. I think he's trying to make a one-to-one correlation to say, don't be like these nations who are doing these things. If the nations weren't doing those things, it would make the command superfluous. And actually, it'd give the command no grounds at all. Kind of concerned that, and again, this is my hyper literal reading that I'm gonna be honest with you on. When I hear people coming to the text trying to justify homosexuality, there was a recent interview on Apologia Radio where Dr. James White and Jeff Durbin debated, I think it's Brandon Robertson, I think is his name, over this issue. And his argumentation was, hey, these words don't really mean what they appear to mean here. So I'd like to know specifically what you think about that text. Do you think that it's a Canaanite overestimation or hyperbolic speak, like overstating the actual sin that's taking place in Canaan? And is it sin? You said that it's possible. There are multiple things on the table. One, we could be overspeaking about what's going on in Canaan, but then two, are the other nations held accountable by some other standard of moral truth, moral law that is binding on their conscience? Again, I would say it's clear that throughout the Bible, nations are destroyed because of these things. But it sounds like you're saying maybe the nations aren't being held accountable by these things. I want to make sure I hear you correctly.
The issue here is not about whether there's homosexual behavior taking place and whether it's acceptable or not. Certainly, in any view of the Old Testament, homosexual practice is not acceptable because it's seen as something that is not within the order that God has called for. So that's not under discussion here. The question is whether the Canaanites have been documented as guilty of these acts. The fact that Sodom and Gomorrah may have been guilty, and I accept that idea, doesn't mean that the Canaanites are. The idea of are these documented acts that they're engaged in, or are they rhetoric? If they're rhetoric, they may or may not actually characterize the Canaanite behavior. I'm not trying to get them off the hook. I'm just trying to ask the question of, is the text clear that they are being punished for these sins? I don't doubt that they have sins. And I don't doubt that there are homosexuals among the Canaanite population. I don't doubt that there are homosexuals among the Israelite population. The question is the text setting this up as what they are being punished for? And we have offered an alternate explanation that this is stereotypical rhetoric that people say about their enemies, and that that's a different thing from documenting it and punishing it. And so I would look for the language of punishing in the text. So this is not about the language of homosexuality or bestiality or those things. That language is there. It's a matter of the language of punishing that I'm looking for. Okay.
And I'll just ask one more of these texts, because we listed 6 or 7 of them, and I'll just do one more. This is the Deuteronomy 18 passage, which you addressed in your book too. So I know you're super familiar with this, obviously. But When you come into the land that the Lord your God is giving you, you shall not learn to follow the abominable practices of those nations. There shall not be found among you anyone who burns his son or daughter as an offering, anyone who practices divination or tells fortunes, or interprets omens, or a sorcerer, charmer, medium, or necromancer, or one who acquires of the dead. For whoever does these things is an abomination to the Lord. And because of these abominations, the Lord your God is driving them out before you. Okay, so that doesn't use the word punish, but one might argue, and it looks like he's saying that the nations were driven out because they practice sorcery and necromancy and so on. But I know you have a different understanding of that. So could you help us understand how you see that text?
Again, the key word here is toivah, the one translated abomination throughout. And Israel is not to follow those practices because they are toivah. They're contrary to Torah order. And so they're
Hmm.
not supposed to practice them. And some of those practices would look like these things. And that's where it talks about burning sons or daughters in the fire, divination, etc., etc. Okay? Whoever does these things is toivah to Yahweh. And that's why the Israelites shouldn't do them. And because of these toivah, that is, that the nations practice of various sorts, and if they're not driven out, they will bring Israel to practice those, as of course happened. And therefore, God is driving them out because of these toivah that Israel will be vulnerable to. If Israel
Okay.
practices them, they will be punished. And
Okay.
so
So
the
you would
Canaanites must
understand.
be driven out because they would influence the Israelites.
Okay. So you would understand because of these abominations, the Lord your God is driving them out before you, not to mean they're being punished for the abominations, but rather, since they're practicing those abominations, it will inspire Israel to practice the abominations, thereby breaking their own covenant and create lots of problems. So you would tie it more to Israel's covenant than you would to a punishment, like a one-to-one punishment for a crime. Is that kind of what you
And
were saying?
many texts speak to that. Many texts speak to that. So, yes, I would translate it that way.
Okay. All right.
Cool. I'd be curious. The New Testament. How does it help us understand the term harem? What are the implications that will take into the Canaanite conquest?
Okay.
Well,
Well, go ahead. Go ahead. You're good.
okay. So, the I would argue strongly that harem is not intended as a basis for us thinking about just war or holy war or really warfare at all. Uh, if we're correct, and of course that's always an if, we're doing our best we can. But if we're correct that the idea is the Israelites need to clear the land so that they will not be corrupted, so that they will be faithful to what Yahweh requires of them. If that's the point, then we have to ask what's the equivalent in the New Testament. And in the book, we suggested the equivalent is that now God's place of presence is not the land, God's place of presence is his people. Just as Israel was supposed to drive out those harmful influences that would lead them away from Yahweh, from the land, so we are supposed to drive out those harmful influences in our life that would lead us to be unfaithful to God in our behavior. So it's all about the behavior of God's people. And
Okay.
Israel had a way to avoid their behavior being unduly influenced, and we likewise have a
Okay.
way. Uh, so it's that kind of idea.
Okay. And then, since you touched on the New Testament, talk to us. Can you maybe expand on that a little bit more? The relationship of Old Testament to New Testament, specifically as it relates to the conquest of Canaan. I know you have at least a whole chapter on this.
Mhm.
Um, love to have you expand on that.
Well, it's very clear when you're reading Paul that he's looking for God's people, Christians, new believers, to have a change in their behavior. You used to be this way, but now you're that way. You used to be murderers and adulterers and liars, but now you're new creation. Your old self is crucified. That's death language. You are crucified with Christ. And
Mhm.
yet you live, but it's not you, but Christ in you. And therefore, God's presence is in us. And so we are supposed to purge ourselves of those things which are old creation, which are the old person. And so we
Mhm.
become new creation. And so that's the basis for
Yeah.
comparison. I would say we get no instruction whatsoever from the book of Joshua about when it's good to do war and how we should do war and things of that sort. That's not the kind of information it's offering us.
Okay.
So, and I want to, because we're kind of getting close to the 6 o'clock hour when it's when we wrap up. So we've only got like another 7 minutes before we have to wrap. But it sounds like what you're saying is that there are nations, there are people in the Old Testament that do receive punishment, but those nations and people that receive punishment, we shouldn't assume that the Canaanites are within that context, within that group. So Sodom and Gomorrah destroyed by fire, King Agag chopped into pieces. That doesn't mean, though, that every time that you have chopped into pieces, like Canaanites, let's say the Canaanites are doing all these evil sins, chop them into little bitty pieces, that we should then assume that it means the very same literal thing that it did with King Agag and it did with Sodom and Gomorrah. So you're not denying that God brings judgment on the nations. You're saying that I don't think that's what's happening here with the Canaanites. I just want to make sure that it's super clear, because we still have people in the comment section going, wait a second, I want to make sure that I understand this correctly. You're not denying judgment. You're just saying that you think this is different.
Absolutely. When we read the passage about the Amalekites or about the Midianites, we find very clear language that God is punishing them for this specific crime. And they name the crimes and they identify it as punishment. And that is the judgment of God. And he is just and they do deserve it. Okay, so we've got those passages. And even in those passages, sometimes herem is used. But in that case, when there's a crime identified and punishment language used, then herem does take the form of a death penalty. And so,
Mhm.
again, we're just following the text for what they say and what they don't say.
Yeah. What would you say to the person who says, Dr. Walton, I don't know that this makes it any better because I kind of felt good about my interpretation that the Canaanites were terrible. So they got killed for their terribleness. The wages of sin is death. So edge of the sword for you. Now I'm dealing with the Canaanites were innocent and they were not so bad. And then God drives them out. That actually sounds worse. Uh, have we actually made God into more of a moral monster by having him boot people out of their cities and kill lots of them because they weren't even especially sinful? What would you say to
Because he
somebody
just wanted
who?
to build. It sounds like Arlington, the AT&T Stadium in Texas, when they knocked down on people's houses because they just wanted to build a
Eminent
big arena. It's like, did
God
God
did
just kick all these
eminent
people out of his
domain in
houses because he wanted a
Palestine.
big old temple? I had to root it back to the Dallas Cowboys, idolatry and
That's a good
stuff.
job. Josh
Yeah,
and I both have Texas roots, so there you
yeah.
go.
And of course, in the book, we do talk about this eminent domain, and we have it in our modern world. O'Hare wants to build an extra runway. People are told they have to leave. We have to clear that
Mhm.
land. It's not good for you to be in there, and it's good for everybody else that we have this extra runway or this extra stadium or this Olympic Village or whatever it is or this park. It's eminent domain, and the idea is that some people are disadvantaged for the good of a larger element. In
Mhm.
in the land, the good is not Israel gets the land. The good is Yahweh is going to live among humans, and Israel has the responsibility of being hosts for his presence. And his
Mhm.
presence on earth is more important than any claims to land that people might have. And
Mhm.
so, in that sense, God is declaring something like eminent domain, clearing
Mhm.
the land for his presence. And that presence, the sanctity of it, has to be protected. And so those people are told that they need to leave. I mean, that's the effect of it. And again, Rahab's speech makes that pretty
Okay.
clear, and God is driving them out. Now, even today in eminent domain, if somebody says, I ain't going, I'm staying here, and you can do anything you want, I'm not leaving. And when the sheriff's office comes along, the guns come out the windows and they start firing. That is, they resist being cleared from the land, yeah, it's going to get bad.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think, Dr. Walton, this would actually create a nice little segue for you to talk about your procedural model view of the conquest of Canaan. You use the analogy of the baking of a cake. And so we're imagining, okay, so God comes in, declares eminent domain, everybody has to go. And if you just go, we can just, everything can be okay. You're not going to die. But if you plant your feet in and say, I'm not going, declare war, well, we're going to kick you out the hard way. But you communicate this as sort of a process that's working towards something with that baking of a cake analogy. Could you unpack that for us?
I can try. That was my son's analogy, so he can explain it better than I
Okay.
can.
Or just use your
But
own analogy or non-analogy, however you want to do
yeah,
it.
yeah. So God has plans and purposes, and he's going to accomplish them. How's that going to work? Is it always going to go exactly the way that he would want it to go? We know that that's not the case. We know that Israelites were unfaithful. We know that Saul was not a good king. We know that the things done by even David, let alone his successors, were not always very good. We know that God has accomplished his plans and purposes, even though people are making desperate mistakes along the way. That does not vindicate their mistakes. It does not say God needed them to make mistakes or wanted them or allowed them to make mistakes. It's just
Mhm.
the idea that God's sovereignty is such that the end result, the kingdom of God, is going to be a wonderful cake. The ingredients that go into it, uh, God is just working out his plans and purposes, even when he's using people who are not doing very nice things, like Nebuchadnezzar destroying Jerusalem. Yet
Mhm.
the biblical text tells us Habakkuk, he was an instrument of God. Cyrus was an instrument of God. It doesn't mean he was a believer. And so
Mhm.
God can use everything. That doesn't mean that he approves of the way that human beings carry out what they do. Now, in that, I'm not saying that the Israelites may have been disobeying God and doing murder that they shouldn't have done. Again, if the people would not be cleared out of the land, then what are you going to do? Again, likewise, it stops short of justifying them to say they did it right every time. We have
Mhm.
no reason necessarily to believe that they did it right every time. So we're more interested in what the text says God is doing and what the text says God wants them to do. And again, we possibly can see some discrepancies there.
Excellent.
Okay.
Well, hey, thank you so much for coming on this program today, Dr. Walton. And then if you're out there, you're watching, you enjoyed this program, make sure to subscribe, like the video, that kind of thing. And just remember, we come out with content Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday from 4 to 5 p.m. Central Standard Time. Tomorrow, the plan is to release a video where we review an interview with Rick Warren and Russell Moore and kind of giving some commentary on that video. And then on Wednesday, we are going over Another Chords of Heaven by Robert Henderson. So that'll be an interesting conversation as well. So make sure to subscribe so you get notified when we come out with all this kind of content. And we will see you next Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday from 4 to 5 p.m. Central Standard Time. Dr. Walton, thank you so much for coming on once again. I appreciate it.
You're quite welcome. Glad to be here.